Okay, well, welcome to week 11. I hope you all had a refreshing, now seems a long time, 2 days ago, I know, break. And this week we are going to hear from Professor C.Gearty of the Law Department here at the LSE, the head of the Institute for Public Affairs, and a much wider commentator on legal issues and human rights. We're going to hear about the judiciary, the courts and justice. We've heard in previous weeks about philosophical influences underpinning British government, constitution, parliament, the institutions of government, and at the end of last term from Patrick Dunleavy about political parties. We're going to begin this term hearing about the really the judicial system in this particular and peculiar system we have here in the United Kingdom. And C.Gearty is going to begin, I think, by saying something about another initiative that the IPA has running as an advertisement before he gets going on his lecture. Connor.
Thank you very much, Tony, and welcome to you all. Marvellous to see so many of you here, actually. I am using... Is this for recording?
Yes.
It's a small place to have this. But
It'll work.
It'll work.
It works every week.
Okay, Tony.
Sorry. Sorry.
Sorry for challenging authority.
Yeah. Far be it from me.
I'm going to use this to try and advertise something because I think it's quite interesting and it's, in my defence, germane. And it's the Institute of Public Affairs, LSE's initiative, which is an initiative intended to produce a new UK constitution and to do so by the novel practice of crowdsourcing. And stop giggling, everybody. And it's actually gone through phase 1, and now we're in phase 2, which launches on Thursday. And it's possibly even in this room, somewhere rather like this room.
It's on this floor. Thai theatre.
And let's see if we can find it. Oh, it's somewhere in here. Let's try one more effort, folks. Sorry.
But in January the 15th.
Ooh, doesn't that work? Ah, God, you're a star. It's not just handing out champagne. There we are. We're launching it on Thursday, and you can't crowdsource a constitution without a crowd. And we need to get some energy behind the event. So I'm really extending an open invitation to you to have a look on the web at Hacking the UK Constitution. It'll be from 6 to half 7. Clive Coleman from the BBC is coming along. And we're going to draft the first 3 to 5 articles of the Constitution. And we're going to finalise the preamble. Stop giggling, I've told you. This is a democratic activity. And then this machine kills fascists. You're the kind of guy we need at crowdsourcing the Constitution. I shall keep my position very left of centre, since there's a computer pointed directly at me with the words, "This machine kills fascists."
Fascism comes in many, many shapes.
So if you can come along, look, it'll be terrific. It'll be terrific, and you might enjoy it. And then for the next 10 weeks or so, there's going to be this incredible platform, it's called, I think, with crowds joining it and voting up issues and so on, and voting on provisions and so on. And at the end of it all, we have a wrap-up event in March. We had a carnival last year, which wrapped up phase 1. And then I think we're going to march on Downing Street, or march on the Speaker. I think John Burke will have us in, actually. And we're going to try and get an MP to table the Constitution, which would be kind of fun.
It would.
And it's sort of a kind of subversive narrative in a year of a massive congratulation about Magna Carta. As you may know, there's an obsession in England with Magna Carta, which they confuse with Britain. Magna Carta from 1215 is a source of endless celebration. And they've given a very distinguished LSE guy, Sir Robert Worcester, no less, oversight of the whole, oversight of the whole set of projects. And so the country is going to have an hysterical bout of self-congratulation in summer around the 800th anniversary of this charter in Runnymede. So we're trying to get in there a little before with something which, as it were, the concept is the people want rather than the barons have chosen. So that's enough of a plug. Thursday, 6 o'clock. And Professor Travers is going to be there briefly.
Briefly, yes.
Briefly. So that's an added attraction. Or whatever. Now, is this for me or is this leftover?
I fear it's leftover, but do drink it. I mean,
is this your water? My job over the course of the next, I should think, 55 to 60 minutes of talk by me, followed by questions by you, if there are any, or observations, is to give you a snapshot of the judiciary in the United Kingdom. Origins, development, current position, which will be done, I think, briskly enough, and then discussions about the location of the courts in the British system of parliamentary sovereignty. If I remember the pressures on that from Europe, both in the shape of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights, and what that pressure means for the judiciary within this jurisdiction, and then talk about the significant changes to judicial power that were wrought by enactment in 1998 of the Human Rights Act, and to look at 3 examples of that change, which are the emergence of a law on privacy, which has had quite important impact on political culture, the emergence of a much stronger judicial review, empowering courts to oversee the executive, and we'll end with the interaction between human rights as interpreted by the judiciary and security. So that's the kind of menu, a little bit of the past on structures, a little bit on sovereignty, and a little bit on sort of contemporary issues. The past is dealt with, I suppose we could sort of turn that off now, couldn't we?
if we know how.
Yeah. Because it's kind of off-putting.
Let me struggle.
All off. No. Left.
Don't plunge the room into darkness. Very good.
The history is, I think, best done, broadly speaking, superficially. Because we haven't had a written constitution, and did I mention that we're drafting one?
You did.
Yes. Shows you how desperate I am to have a crowd. Because we don't have a written constitution, you have to secure an understanding of the British Constitution by kind of digging up successive layers of previous activity. And in a way, the constitution that we have is a set of layers that have been kind of laid down over time as each generation has produced a sort of new version of the past. So it's historically sensitive but unsatisfactory from a sort of lawyer's point of view. And because we need to, I suppose, start somewhere, we start with the notion of a king in the post-Norman invasion period with, like for the purposes of our constitutional story, all power. So this is a 13th, 14th century monarch who has all power centered on, and at the time it was usually him, possibly always him, until, Trivial Pursuit question, Mary? Improbable.
Depends what you think about Queen Matilda, really, doesn't
Queen
it?
Matilda. You've made her up to catch me out.
No. Stephen and Matilda.
Stephen. Oh, Stevens. Yeah, forget it. King. And therefore, there's no concept of separation of powers. So these powers we pragmatically might describe today as legislative, judicial, and executive, but that would have had no meaning at the time. So the king makes, in inverted commas, law. The king brings law into practice, and the king adjudicates on disputes. So we have all the way through our system to now a strong sense of royal ownership of the courts. Now that is initially at odds with our understanding of our culture as a modern democratic one. But what we need to understand in order to make sense of the British Constitution is that labels do not connote substance. So what you have right beside us here, to take one of the examples I'll give, are the Royal Courts of Justice. And in the Royal Courts of Justice, Her Majesty's government is frequently brought to account for having exceeded the law in what I'll talk about a bit later on, judicial review proceedings. Guess who brings judicial review proceedings? Her Majesty. If you look at the law reports, the cases will be let's say from the criminal field, first and straightforward, take a name at random, Travers. R and Travers indicates criminal proceedings, but they are brought by Her Majesty. More pertinently, in the Royal Courts of Justice, supposing, take another name at random, Travers, sought to challenge a policy implemented in law by a local authority or the government, supposing it was Pickles. What's his department called these days, Tony?
Department for Communities and Local Government.
Communities and Local Government. Something happened. The case would be called this. R. Travers versus the Secretary of State for whatever Eric Pickles is. The conceit is that you think the government has done something wrong, you go to Her Majesty and you throw yourself on the floor of Her Majesty's palace and say, do something for me. And Her Majesty takes the action. So to this day, if you go into the law buildings, you look at the law reports in the library, you'll see the organisation of the cases in this way. The most frequently local authorities lots. The most frequent to be found there is the Home Secretary. A lot of the asylum cases will be R bracket X versus the Secretary of State for the Home Department. And these are two indicators among many, not going to linger on it, of the historical origins, tautological, of the origins of our court system in an undifferentiated, all-powerful monarch. But we're talking a very long time ago. What happened was, over a long period of time, the functions began to delineate. There's a whole story you will have done about the Privy Council, the Cabinet, the House of Lords, how these kind of grew into substantive entities. That's not my story. The courts, Her Majesty's judges, began at a, we call it today, central level, to grow specialisms. And this happened through the medieval period and continued until the great reforms of the 19th century, where you have particular courts that you would take certain cases into. And you had, for example, the Court of Chancery, you had the Court of Common Pleas, you had the Court of Queen's Bench. Now these were high courts, and they were courts that had developed a kind of historical ownership of particular jurisdictions. and they were presided over important judges. And this became absolutely over-rigorous by the early 19th century. So what was happening was what you have, if you've read Bleak House, what you have encountered were the circular arguments in the departments of, for example, circumlocution, jaundice, and jaundice. These became emblematic of encounters with justice in the 19th century. And part of the great Victorian reforms, which we saw in so much of public life and local government at the end and in public health and so on, was also a reform aimed at the reorganization of the judiciary. So what emerged was something fairly recognizable to us today, which is in, I think, 1876, the Supreme Judicature Act. Geoffrey? Nodding. Supreme Judicature Act, 1876, which is an organization of the courts in a particular way, which is grouping them together, which is turning them into creatures of the same framework. That's all we need to know. Interestingly, because the whole thing was so historical, an oddity had survived into the 19th century. And the oddity that had survived into the 19th century was that the House of Lords had a judicial function. Now, this makes sense if you remember that there was no such thing as separation of powers when this thing got going, and nobody had got round to abolishing appeal to the House of Lords. So in a famous, and indeed lords could show up. If you were a lord, you could adjudicate. And in a famous case involving an Irishman, Daniel O'Connell, they were so keen to get him on some trumped-up charge of sedition or whatever it was, that he faced a bench of a whole lot of sort of deadbeats, has-beens, drunkards and alcoholics who were exercising their right as peers to sit in judgment in a case which was on appeal from earlier courts. And that was in the early...
So be sure that the whole House of Lords could act as the Supreme Court.
They could show up, exactly. Exactly. Right. Okay. Now, what happened was, this was, of course, unacceptable to the reforming Victorians. This was absurd. And it was briefly abolished. But interestingly, it was quickly returned to. So we had a special law, which I think may have been called something like the Appellate Jurisdiction Act, and that put the House of Lords on a rational basis as the supreme appellate jurisdiction for this country. Now, by a rational basis, I mean that it was no longer the case that any old judge could show up, that there were specific judges who were in the House of Lords as judges, and they were people who were either lords already, but didn't have to be. They would be promoted, and they would become what was called the law lords. So into the 1980s and 90s, so right up to date, with a few changes I'm going to mention, our system at the central level, more on justices of the peace and magistrates' courts in a minute, but not much more, took recognisable shape in the 19th century. We had the Royal Courts of Justice down there with a bunch of what are now called divisions of the Royal Courts of Justice. So a family issue will go into the court, the family division of the High Court. An issue to do with wills or probate will go into the Chancery division of the High Court. The Queen's Bench division deals with nuisance cases, trespass cases, but they are divisions of the same court. And appeal lies to the Court of Appeal, Criminal Division, dealing with both substance and sentencing, and Civil Division, dealing with matters related to family, chancery, Queen's Bench. And a further appeal, because it survived the cull of the 19th century, to the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, stocked by professional judges who had been promoted to the House of Lords. And so a perk of being a judge in the highest court in the land was membership of the upper chamber. There's been a change in what I've just described, but it's a recent change, and I'll mention it just before I move into more of the substance. But I needed to just notice that one of the more significant contributions that England has made, England may be the right word, has been its evolution of a very sophisticated system of local justice. And while this was developing, Henry II, Trivial Pursuit, century, I won't look for specific dates, century, Henry II,
13.
Who said 13th? Tony is actually intervening to show that he knows it. Very good. No.
I did say 30, but it might have been wrong. I wasn't sure.
12th.
Oh, see, 12th. I was wrong.
Interestingly, pre-Magna Carta. Did I mention Magna Carta in the Constitution launch?
Twice so far.
There's some latecomers. A system of itinerant justice was created, and it was very important in the centralization of the idea of the country. Was the king's judges went out into the country, and that started incredibly early here, 12th century. And the process of supersession of the ancient jurisdictions took centuries, because there was a mass of jurisdictions, and these traveling justices doing the king's justice, keeping the king's peace, were innovative and over time quite a powerful bonding agent in the emergence of a coherent kingdom. We still have a strong system of magistrates' courts which reflects these ancient local officers. And one of its more special features remains that many of them are non-stipendiary, unremunerated. So there is a strong voluntarist dimension to justice at the local level, which is, at one level, is impressive, but then it does skewer the bench in the direction of people who can afford it, which does privilege certain people, etc., etc. So there are pros and cons. There is a county court, which is a statutory creation, which is providing at the local level for more serious cases, but with that addition, and a crown court, which deals with more serious criminal matters, also a statutory creation, you have a snapshot of the English court system. England, rather insultingly to the Welsh, includes Wales here. It does not include Scotland. Scotland has historically got a separate legal system, which we're not even addressing, and in the Act of Union with Scotland in 1700 and, not bad, good politics students, 7, one of the areas that was acknowledged to continue to be a Scottish area was a devolved function, I suppose, or a to be respected function, was the legal system. So we're talking about England and Wales. We're not talking about Ireland either, though the Irish mimicked the English in many ways. So local, magistrates' court, crown court and county court, the latter two statutory and fairly recent. Central, a mass of separate independent courts, chaos, 19th century reform, the Royal Courts of Justice with the High Court, on appeal to the Appeal Court, on further appeal to the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. As recently as 1998, we had the spectacle of a decision of the House of Lords in the famous case of Pinochet being delivered in the chamber of the House of Lords with now televisions present. So, because there was a very great controversy about that case, they had to rerun it because one of the judges was revealed as being a supporter of amnesty, and it was thought that that would have prejudiced General Pinochet's chances. And they reran it, if you remember. And it was a remarkable thing to see these judges in the chamber delivering judgment in a country committed to separation of powers. Now, there were two views about this. One view, which was, I have to say, a view I broadly shared, was relax about this. It doesn't matter an awful lot. What matters are the kinds of people who are there. What matters is the kind of work they do. They're not contributing much to House of Lords debates. Yes, a few of them, after they retire, do not die early enough and do show up in the House of Lords and blather on. There was one amendment to the Human Rights Bill where Lord Simon of Gladesdale had tabled an amendment. Lord Simon, as I recall, needed not one but two hearing aids and had large trumpets in either ear to facilitate hearing. And in the proceedings in Hansard, you can hear them calling his amendment and then somebody like Lord Irving saying, Lord Simon appears to have wandered off. So he was a very good judge, by the way, a very good judge. But he was, I think the relevant modern remark is past his sell by date. The view that's relaxed about the judges in the House of Lords was also relaxed about an even more eccentric judicial figure, the Lord Chancellor. And I've not mentioned the Lord Chancellor. And the Lord Chancellor is another creature of history. And the Lord Chancellor, historically, has combined not one, not two, but three of the roles in the British Constitution. The Lord Chancellor is a member of the executive in that he, and it's always been, has it always? No, I imagine there must have been briefly. There were a lot of Lord Chancellors. No, he, I don't think there's been a woman. He has, sits in cabinet, advises, etc. He's also Speaker. Is he still Speaker of the House of Lords?
No, there's now a separate Speaker.
Separate Speaker. And he would show up as a judge in the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. All three. All three. Now, Lord Irving of Larg, who was Tony Blair's great mentor as a barrister and his key advisor in the early days of the New Labour administration of 1997 onwards, exercised his right to deliver judgments in the House of Lords. So you would read the judgments of the Lord Chancellor. He also was an active figure in the House of Lords, and he was, as everybody knew, as a member of the Cabinet, a key advisor of Tony Blair. So one point of view is relax, look at the substance. The English Constitution is kind of fuzzy in a sort of funny, kind of exotic sort of way. The other point of view is this is altogether too messy. This just doesn't make sense, and it does damage. The important extra point. That separation of powers is about the control of power and about accountability, and merging all these things together is something which we cannot afford because it means that decisions are less good than they would otherwise be, and accountability isn't as effective. The latter perspective triumphed. And there was, under New Labour, a rationalisation. Some of us think the rationalisation was because Mr. Blair wanted to get rid of Lord Irving, but remained afraid of Lord Irving, who had a very strong personality and had been his pupil master in Chambers. And the easiest way to get rid of him was to say, Derry, I'd love you to stay, but we've just abolished the post of Lord Chancellor. I was at a meeting of Justice, which had argued for decades for the abolition of the post of Lord Chancellor. And one of my colleagues came in white-faced to say that Lord Chancellor had been abolished. And we were all terrified because we didn't think anybody would take us seriously. Now somebody, to our amazement and shock, had. He was abolished in a press release, which I think had been concocted over a cup of tea on an afternoon in February. It was the next day they realised there were 14,568 transitional powers that needed to be addressed before you could abolish him, because there was quite a lot that happened in his name. So we rejigged it, and he's back. But he's back as a much diminished figure. He may have increased in height, but he's diminished in stature, because the current Lord Chancellor is Christopher Grayling, and he is primarily Secretary of State for Justice, but he is also, as an add-on, Lord Chancellor. He is not a lawyer, the first non-lawyer to hold this position. He is now not able to sit in cases at the top of our judicial body, because if he were to wander the corridors of the House of Lords in the hope of finding the appellate committee in order to join it, he wouldn't find it because it's been abolished. So not only has the Lord Chancellor been, as it were, reduced in importance, but the court that used to sit in the House of Lords, on a corridor at the House of Lords, the appellate committee has ceased to function, and the judges are now to be found in the Supreme Court. And that was another New Labour reform. And so we have rationalised at the high end. The rationalisation has kept in place the High Court, kept in place the Court of Appeal, but has put at the top of the system a Supreme Court. The final point to make about structures is that probably the most important change that has happened, certainly in my academic lifetime, I have not alluded to yet, and that is the impact of electronic resources on the judiciary. When I started teaching, the single greatest thing a teacher could bring to students in law was access to judgments. We had what were called law reports, and then they were supplemented by weeklies called the All England Law Reports and the Weekly Law Reports. Nobody knew who decided what went into them, or in what order, or when. So there were also unreported judgments which had equal status, but unreported judgments were, of course, unreported and therefore inaccessible. So the law was not available. In the extreme case of my own jurisdiction, Ireland, we had Miss Semple in the library, who was the keeper of the unreported judgments. The difficulty with Ireland was nobody really was editing the law reports. So there were no law reports to speak of, or rather they were 10 years out of date, and a slim volume of 5 or 6 judgments would emerge from time to time. In other words, the law was inaccessible. What has happened has been that the internet, combined with a reform at the end of the 90s, has meant that all of you, if you felt like it, could read any judgment at any moment. And it's worth pausing on this because students who are not in law should read judgments. What has happened has been we've moved away from citation, which tells you what law report the case is in. For example, 1980, square brackets, QB 721 would direct you to the 721st page of the 1980 volume of Queen's Bench, where you'd find the case. But they would be in no chronological order, and there would be no way of knowing which came first apart from reading the dates at the top, and many judgments would not be in it. We've moved from that system to a system introduced by Lord Woolf of neutral citation. And it is a thing of beauty. Every case in the High Court the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court has got a neutral citation, which starts with the year, which then has EW, and if it's High Court, it's like that. If it's Court of Appeal, Civil Division, it's like that. If it's Court of Appeal, Criminal Division, it's like that. And then a number. The first case in the High Court, sorry, this should be EW, HC, England and Wales High Court, would be 1. And it is literally the first case in 2015. And then afterwards, FAM or CHD or QB. And similarly, first case in the Court of Appeal Civil Division for 2015, that. So, and then the Supreme Court is even easier because all you need to do is go on the Supreme Court website and they give you them all in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There is no excuse, therefore, for not being able to access judgments now. It is fantastic. So when I set cases for my students, because cases is our trade. When I set cases for my students, all you need to do is type that in and it comes up. It's fantastic.
Did this mean that hitherto precedent, which is so important all in all of this system, was just sort of randomly linked to the cases that were published?
Absolutely. Knowledge was power.
And who was deciding? Was it
Buggins in some room running the Incorporated Council of Law Reporting?
But a part of the court system or just a private
enterprise?
Right. Okay.
Private enterprise, Jeffrey? It was, wasn't it? Yeah. Private enterprise. Got going in Victorian times. And then Bloggs, QC, knows that Mr. Justice Cockacarrot has produced a judgment because he was in the case and has the judgment, and it becomes gold dust because it's an available, unreported judgment available to Bloggs. As a result, the judges are constantly deploring the excess of citation of authorities. And they're always calling for it to be slimmed down. What happens is barristers will photocopy everything just in case they might need it. And because they're not sure whether they'll need it, because they don't read the papers until just before the case, my lords will be confronted with, say, 27 lever arch files, one of which will be consulted, and that is a scandal as well. The Supreme Court has tried to turn everything into electronics. The Supreme Court judges, you can now watch them on the telly or tapping away, but the guys in front of them have all their lever arch files. And a piece of knowledge, I'm a barrister as well, it's a nice business. You have no idea how much these companies charge to prepare cases for the Supreme Court. There's a company who's been doing it, I think, since, if you include the House of Lords, 1702, and the person I think in charge may still be alive, and it is a specialism which really does provide an argument for competition, I think. Anyway, that is as may be. That's structure over with.
Very good.
Substance.
Can I ask one question before you stop?
Absolutely.
In the modern, in all of this system, who now, because it is germane to the separation of powers question, who appoints? How do judges now get appointed into this system?
Yes, thank you, Tony. Yeah, that's worth saying, actually. Until quite recently, chap shows up in court. One of the last ones of these was Sir Thomas Legge. Has a look at the barrister. Oh, he's rather good, isn't he? And there is a sort of tap on the shoulder at a drinks party. And sort of then suddenly he's a High Court judge. And there was a feeling, again, on the part of some people, it's mirroring the debate about centralisation of the court system and the Lord Chancellor. Some people think, well, actually what really matters is substance, not the tap on the shoulder issue. And also some of our more radical judges were appointed by the tap on the shoulder. The advantage of tap on the shoulder is for the right fellow doing the tapping, you can smuggle in quite a few good guys from a political point of view, non-fascists, if you know what I mean. People who you wouldn't feel the need to assassinate, though you would, of course, destroy most of the judges. I advise that you don't become a barrister. But then there was a push for accountability, representativeness. You know, there's too many white men, Oxbridge educated, so let's have an ad. So now we have an ad, and you apply, and you're interviewed. The head of the LSE law department is at this moment sifting applications from potential judges, and the idea was to achieve more representation, but there's a little catch. You have to be a practicing barrister of a certain number of years standing. The result, wholly unsurprising, is that the individuals concerned bear a remarkable and disturbing resemblance to the people who used to get the tap on the shoulder. The Guardian ran a very good front page on the occasion of one of the more recent selection procedures having been finished, a picture of 7 white men, all aged 52 and a half, all educated in Oxford, Cambridge, and I assume the LSE, and it was the reform in operation. And actually anybody could have told you that. Anybody who knows a bit of sociology could have told you that. So it's actually harder to pick mavericks when you have an open process like that, with ideal CVs from extremely focused, extremely affluent, and very lucky privately funded individuals. So it's not had the panacea effect that it was thought it might have. The Supreme Court remains a scandal, and the scandal is that there's only one woman on the Supreme Court, Lady Brenda Hale, Baroness Brenda Hale, and when she entered, she was the only woman, and when she leaves, she'll be the only woman. And I think, if I may say so, it is a deliberate insult. They are not picked by the ad process. They have a different process involving the judges. And there have been appointments where really the avoidance of the appointment of a woman or somebody from a non-Caucasian group has almost looked to me to be deliberate. Yet another white bloke shows up from the Court of Appeal, and in one case, outrageously, from the bar itself, when the number of candidates who are available were passed over is deplorable. Enough on that?
Very good. Thank you.
Substance. Substance. This is where we come across a topic with which you will be very familiar. Parliamentary sovereignty. The courts are the King's courts, and they're on the way, and they're differentiating a bit, and they're sort of independent places, and there's a Court of King's Bench in the 17th century. And there is a Parliament, as you know, and the Parliament has already differentiated itself into Commons and Lords. So there's an operating constitution that bears a degree of resemblance to our modern constitution. In the 17th century, the courts took their role as royal courts seriously. And in the civil wars of that period, and in the turmoil up to the civil wars, tended to side with the Crown. The result was that the courts in the 17th century tended to support the Crown in the Crown's battles against Parliament. A Parliament that was not democratic, but a Parliament that was increasingly anti-royalist for various reasons to do with religion and high politics. At that time, 17th century, judges, and into the first 10 years or so of the 18th century, judges held, some of them, that they had a right to overturn acts of Parliament. There were dicta from judges reported in the English reports, an obscure but fascinating set of reports, which is all we have from that period, which would say more or less things that don't work with right and reason are parliamentary acts that are null and void. The common law allows us to say they're not laws. That's important. It's important because there is an history in England and Wales, a history of a judicial consciousness of the capacity to overturn legislation. But it's ancient. This goes away with the success of Parliament in 1689, with the assertion as part of the victory of the concept of parliamentary sovereignty at the end of the 17th century, and with the embedding of parliamentary sovereignty in our culture in the 18th but mainly 19th century. And the courts played their part in the 19th and 20th centuries in embedding parliamentary sovereignty in our constitutional culture. So what did that mean? It meant, in a way that's fascinating for law students in their first year, it meant that you had to decide what an Act of Parliament was in order to give it priority. So, for example, in the old days, 19th century, there used to be lots of private Acts of Parliament. In fact, most stuff was private Acts of Parliament. What happened if some private concern got an Act of Parliament by fraud? What happened if some private Act of Parliament was ludicrously misguided? Answer, in cases, the titles to which I won't bore you with now, was all we do is we check, did it pass the Lords? Sorry, did it pass the Commons? Did it pass the Lords? Did it have the royal assent? Then it's an Act of Parliament. We're not asking about whether Parliament was misled. We're not asking whether there was a second reading and a committee. We're just looking at, I think it might even be called the parliamentary roll. And it was called the unenrolled bill rule until somebody discovered there was no parliamentary roll, and that if you were to make that the criteria of legitimacy, there'd be no laws at all. So we changed that. I think somebody lost the parliamentary roll, or it was called fire or something in classically English. You know. So even as late as 1967, in a case I will, if it was 1967, it's about 1967, in a case called Pickin, P-I-C-K-I-N, and the British Railways Board, an argument to the effect that the British Railways Board had been deceitful and horrible and the Minister had misled Parliament, produced a response from the court, the highest court, the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, Lord Reid. Well, even if they did, that's nothing to do with us. We've had to look at the parliamentary roll, though we know it doesn't exist, and we've seen that it passed the Commons, passed the Lords, and has the assent of the Crown. That's enough for us. Now, that was also taken to mean, in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, that you didn't touch much executive actions either. And here's a distinction which lawyers are familiar with, which you'll understand very easily. You have the Act, and Acts of Parliament are untouchable. But Acts of Parliament do nothing. Acts of Parliament do not enter people's homes. Acts of Parliament do not stop and search you. Acts of Parliament do not physically engage with anybody. They are bits of paper. What they, however, usefully do is empower. They empower people to do things. Usually, the people that are empowered to do things are public authorities, broadly. Although, of course, private Acts of Parliament empower other persons to do things, and even Acts of Parliament in the old days used to allow you to divorce if you were rich enough. But what I'm talking about is the empowerment of, for the sake of clarity, public authorities. They might be local authorities, they might be the police, they might be anybody you care to talk about, secretaries of state and so on. What do they empower them to do? They empower them to do either make decisions or make regulations. So lots and lots of people, public authorities, make rules or they make decisions. The difference between making a rule and making a decision is a rule is putting in place a scheme which will apply to lots of later decisions. A decision is a decision. So, for example, the Home Secretary may exclude a foreign national where he is satisfied that it is in the interest of national security. A decision. The Home Secretary may make rules on the expulsion of foreign persons in the interest of national security. Rules. These are called delegated legislation, and this is called decision-making by the state, executive decision-making. Something called bylaws, local authority bylaws. They are delegated legislation under, from memory, the Local Government Act 1898 or whenever it was. Maybe that was the Irish one. 1888. 88. Now, you can see immediately that these rules and decisions, rules can produce decisions, these can be things people don't like. You can find your house knocked down, as Mr. Cooper did on his return from work in 1865. Wandsworth had knocked the house down. Or as Mr. Hosenball found when he was being escorted to the airport because the Home Secretary had decided he was not a good person to have in the country. So things are done by people under the Acts of Parliament. You cannot question the Act of Parliament in the British system, but you can question the decision. How can you question the decision? You can say, not, I don't like it, not, this is unjust, a word that is not used in court and not used by any lawyers, but is used a lot by losing litigants. You say, that's not what the Act lets you do. That's what you say. So you say, not, I'm against parliamentary sovereignty. You say, I'm in favour of parliamentary sovereignty. That Act, which God preserve, said the public authority could do A, B, and C, but you're doing D. How dare you do D? That's called, in English law, the doctrine of ultra vires, beyond powers. And it has a seductive simplicity. It empowers the courts to control the executive in the name of parliamentary sovereignty. The courts stop being the enemies of Parliament and become the friends of Parliament. It's the executive that tries to steal a march, and the march, having been stolen, is exposed by the court. Or Travers versus the Secretary of State for the Home Department. The Secretary of State for the Home Department says, this is a typical one, says, you're trying to pull a fast one, renewing your TV license under the regulations, knowing the price will go up. I'm not going to let you do it. I'm confiscating your TV license. You go to the Queen and you sue the Secretary of State for the Home Department and you say you're not allowed to do that under the Act of Parliament, and you win. Famous case called Congreve and Home Office. So, Cooper and Wandsworth, London Borough Council, was about 1865, and that was an unusual case. Mostly, courts did nothing. Mostly, they gave the executive full rein. Now, I'm talking about from the First World War through to about 1960, where the courts had this notional power to constrain the executive, but they did not exercise it. Now, there were some cases, not many. In the cases, the courts tended to interpret their power rather narrowly. We don't have really the opportunity to talk about why, but primarily it's the influence of war. It produces a kind of deferential personality on the part of the courts, cold and hot, and also the judges were a bit anxious about taking on the welfare state. And the big fact of the 20th century was the emergence of an administrative system, and there were a whole bunch of LSE academics in the van of this saying, we've designed a system to improve the lot of the English people, and I'm damned if I'm going to let the judges do what they're doing in America, which they were with Roosevelt's New Deal, dismantling our decisions by supposed interpretations, which are in fact merely hostile readings. So they were very quiet. So there weren't many books on what was called administrative law. Administrative law was about what central government did, what local authorities did, what tribunals did. It was boring. Run brilliantly, sort of scrutinised by John Griffiths, an old LSE man, but boring. The courts didn't do much. So in about 1960, we have a picture of a country where the judges have very little role. So you have a paradox. The High Court is in Parliament, the Lord Chancellor is everywhere. It seems to be an intermixing of regimes, but the courts are not players. And what we have seen since then is a gradual, this is the third part, I guess, the emergence of a judicial kind of power is the driving of a much stronger role for the judiciary. And it runs like this. Starting in the 1960s, the judges begin to interpret their power a bit more robustly. What do I mean by robust? Well, if the Act has specific words which are ignored, the minister may deport foreigners, and the minister deports somebody born in Wigan, the courts will say, I'm not sure the Wigan is foreign. Is Wigan foreign? They'll say, have I been to Wigan? Is that where my school was? No, my school was somewhere else. Where was my school? I don't remember. I was beaten too often to recall it properly. That was gratuitous. Sorry, Tony. That's right. But what happens where the language of the Act is subjective? Is satisfied that the individual is foreign? Has reasonable grounds to believe that the individual is foreign? Is of opinion that? Parliament gives executive powers like that all the time. Why? Because the executive draft the powers that Parliament enact. It makes sense. Rainy day legislation. I want to keep my options open. So lots of stuff in Acts is vague. The question then becomes one which had been avoided in the earlier periods of what are we going to do about language like is of opinion that. During the war, a very infamous case called Liversidge and Anderson, the judges had said where the Secretary of State has reasonable cause to believe a person to be of hostile association means if he thinks he has reasonable cause to believe. So keen were they to render it subjective, producing the most memorable dissent in English legal history, that by Lord Atkin in Liversidge and Anderson, 1942 appeals cases, 206 or something. Read it, where he likens the majority judgment of the House to Alice in Wonderland. You know, very, very interesting. But in the 60s, they began to question that. So they began to say, actually, our job of ultra vires thing is not just the words, it's to actually challenge subjective words. So there emerged a new subject, the subject of judicial review. Stanley de Smith, also LSE, published a book called Judicial Review of Administrative Action. Suddenly, the courts are getting involved. They are looking at whether or not, in forming that opinion, the minister has acted in a way that no reasonable minister could have acted. Wigan could not conceivably be understood to be foreign, and the minister, in saying it's foreign, is acting unreasonably on the basis of a case called Wednesbury, which you will hear, if you dabble in law, you'll hear that, Wednesbury case. The minister has failed to take into account relevant considerations. The minister has taken into account irrelevant considerations. The minister has acted, Lord Denning and Congreve, the TV licence case, with an improper purpose. He wants to raise money. That's not what this statute is about. And so the 60s and 70s are 2 decades where there's a litany of increasingly abrasive judicial interventions. The lawyers are empowered, excited, their day has come. A case called Anasminic v. the Foreign Compensation Commission, I think, 1969-ish. Parliament had said, from the determination of this commission there shall be no appeal. The House of Lords Judicial Committee, Appellate Committee said, that's absolutely true. There is no appeal from any determination, that was it. Determination of the commission, of course not. But a determination which is done in violation of natural justice is not a determination at all. It is a mere purported determination. And the Act does not save purported determinations. So therefore, this decision, which looked to everybody else to be a determination by the Commission, is not a determination by the Commission at all, and we set it aside. That's the high point. Words mean what the final authority says they mean. And in Anna's Minnick, this was brought to that extraordinary conclusion. There are many cases in the 1970s which were controversial. We had the usual interminable debates about schools, comprehensive, not comprehensive, and so on. House of Lords holds that a minister, a Labour minister, was acting, get this, so unreasonably that no reasonable minister would have acted in that way when he came to the conclusion that the local authority had been acting unreasonably. I love that case. I love that case. So there was 3 operative meanings of reasonable in the same sentence. Fantastic. Law students, superior quality. I mean, it's fantastic. None of them have a clue what I'm talking about. None of them have a clue what I'm talking about. Very controversial. So in the 60s and 70s, into the 80s, actually, surprisingly, counterintuitively, there's quite a lot of strong sense in places like LSE that the judges have overstepped the mark, that the judges have gone too far, even though we had parliamentary sovereignty. Now, it's against this background of an emerging judicial review where the Queen is being mustered, as it were, on behalf of applicants to challenge government on the basis of Acts of Parliament, but now you understand it, Acts of Parliament which have been greatly expanded by the courts to build into account a whole lot of stuff about kind of relevant considerations, irrelevant considerations, acting reasonably and so on, that we see the emergence of the human rights thing. Because, tiny bit of backstory, British litigants have been able to take the United Kingdom to the Strasbourg Commission and then court since 1966. So in the 60s, late 60s, 70s through 80s into the 90s, there were loads of cases which involved no Queen, you know, she wouldn't bother with her, it would be Travers versus the United Kingdom. So if you lost this case here, you'd be a victim of human rights abuse, you'd say, and you would travel up to the European Commission, as it then was, and thereafter the court, and you might or might not win. So the language of human rights entered English law through the back door of international law. So we had an odd system. And it was best summed up in a case in 1989 called Brind. Actually, yeah, I set some reading, so all of this will be in the reading if you've done it. Brind. The British were finding these politically violent opponents in Northern Ireland. They decided one of the things they would do is they would deprive them of what I think it may have been Leon Britton or Margaret Thatcher called the oxygen of publicity. And so they decided to have a ban on what they could say. And it belongs now, we think, to an innocent age, because the ban on what the members of provisional Sinn Féin could say was only a ban on precisely hearing their voices. It was not a ban on synchronised actors saying what they were saying at exactly the moments their mouths moved. So it was ludicrous. But it was what was required to placate Margaret Thatcher and stop her sort of bombing Dublin, I think. This was challenged in English law. And it was challenged in all the way up to the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. And it has to be challenged on the grounds of unreasonableness. Because that's the English system. We don't have human rights. When it gets to Strasbourg, it's challenged on the grounds of breach of free speech. Now, it loses in both. That's not the point I'm making. There is a different structure of reasoning in the domestic court and into the European court. So this, again, does not appeal to the neatness of the legal mind. And in the 1990s, with New Labour changing, with the judges coming out in favour of it, a head of steam builds up to have this European thing in English law. And so that brings us to, finally, here, the 1998 Human Rights Act. What does it do? The United Kingdom's Human Rights Act builds on this system. So it's an act, and it creates new criteria for the control of public authorities. New criteria for the control of public authorities. So it's saying not only do you need to check the words in your act, not only do you need to make sure that if it's subjective, that you're acting reasonably, etc., but that you're not breaking human rights as well. So it becomes a kind of new criteria for judicial review. So instead of having to go to Strasbourg, or Travers and the Secretary of State for the Home Department has got a little box in the application form. I know I've done it. And the little box says, have you got a human rights point? You say yes. And so you turn up in court and you say, my lord, I have three arguments. One is irrationality. The other is illegality, which means that it just doesn't follow the words in the Act. And thirdly, my lord, it's a breach of the Convention. So this empowers the judges. It empowers the judges. But, it cannot be used to destroy Acts of Parliament. Very important. The Prime Minister's got that wrong on occasion, I think deliberately. Tony Blair has got it wrong, certainly. The Human Rights Act does not have any section in it which says you can strike down the Act. You can fiddle, interpret, in order to make sure that the stuff is convention compliant. You can issue something kind of weird called a declaration of incompatibility if you really don't like what has happened. But no English judge can declare the Act of Parliament null because of a breach of human rights. All that judge can do is issue a declaration of incompatibility. Two things might then happen. The British government has to decide what to do about that, and Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights, which remains above the fray, might choose to say that's not an effective remedy. We don't know what Strasbourg's going to do in the long term. In the short term, they've accepted it as long as it's always implemented. There were three case studies, very briefly. 2001, David Blunkett, as Secretary of State for the Home Department, decides to push through the House of Parliament the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act, Part 4 of which involves the incarceration indefinitely and without trial of suspected international terrorists. The Appellate Committee of the House of Lords holds in a judgment in December 2004 that this is a breach of the Human Rights Act, in particular Articles 14 with Article 5, non-discrimination in the enjoyment of the right to liberty, and that it has not been protected by the claim to an emergency that the government has made. This did not mean that those men, and they were all men, were released from Belmarsh Prison. They stayed in Belmarsh Prison because all the courts could do was issue a declaration of incompatibility. That's case study 1. Case study 2, I've already anticipated. Judicial review has had this big impetus of a new criteria for judicial review, namely compatibility with convention rights. And that means public authorities have more stuff to keep in mind when they are making decisions. And a very important point that's occupied the courts a lot has been, do they need explicitly to take into account the convention, or is it enough for them retrospectively to be seen to have acted in a convention-compatible way? The answer is the latter. It comes up a lot in regard to schools or planning authorities. If a school sets out a uniform policy, which has certain controls on religious dress, does it need to have checked compatibility with the Human Rights Act while it does that? Or is it enough for the judges to look at it in the round afterwards and decide it's okay or not okay? The House of Lords, as it then still was, said it was okay to look at it afterwards in the round. Governing bodies of schools cannot be expected to have human rights experts on their governing body. And the last one was privacy. And it's worth mentioning because we've left aside the common law almost completely. In fact, of course, the common law's ticked on, continued, and every now and again bits of common law continue because no Act of Parliament has removed them. And the question arose quite early on, does the common law have to be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights? And in a famous case involving Michael Douglas and his then wife, Catherine Zeta-Jones, who I believe is from Wales, the courts held that there was no right to privacy in English law, English common law, but because the Human Rights Act contained a right to respect for privacy in Article 8 in Schedule 1 to the Act, namely the Convention right, it applied to them because the court needed itself to apply it, because even though, getting complicated, even though they were, Catherine Zeta-Jones and Hello magazine, private parties, the court was not a private party, And the court, therefore, was the public authority that was duty-bound to apply in its actions, which included remedies, the Convention on Human Rights. So the Human Rights Act has produced a right to privacy, right to respect for privacy in this country, which did not exist. There was a poor man called Gordon Kay, who was photographed by the Daily sort of abysmal intrusion in his hospital bed, and he took an action and lost, 1999. That can no longer happen. The Hugh Grants, the J.K. Rowlings, the Naomi Campbells leaving their drug treatment centre to go to give a talk about how they've never had drugs and so on, are now able to deploy their lawyers in able to injunction's important, to injunct the story or sue for damages.
Those are theoretical examples.
Yeah, there are theoretical examples, and I think nobody at home should take them remotely seriously. This man is, in fact, a fantasist, and I want to say that I have a high regard for the good work done by, for example, Naomi Campbell. Reduced damages. The three examples have created powerful enemies. Last point. The newspapers thought the Human Rights Act would give them freedom of expression. Nobody told them about the right to privacy. And they're very annoyed about the right to privacy. As they fight off new technology, they desperately need to invade the privacy of people to persuade people to buy their newspapers. And they have now equipped their enemies, the celebrities who have money, with a weapon with which to fight back. That's my opinion as to why most newspapers have become hostile to the Human Rights Act. Secondly, the interventions that the courts have taken on issues of national security have, of course, led the secret state to regard the courts with a degree of hostility. So they have made powerful enemies among secretaries of state and security people, and their cheerleaders in the press. Thirdly, the increase in judicial review has actually fueled criticism of the legal profession as being a kind of gravy train, and as political correctness, as it were, gone mad, and as equipping prisoners and other bad eggs with opportunities to waste the public's time with their opportunistic cases along the lines of, I'm about to be raped and murdered in my prison cell by a psychopathic maniac, and I'd like not to have to go back there tonight. Please, can you tell the governor that forcing me back there is unlawful? The answer, of course, now is you can't, because the government has deprived prisoners of access to legal aid, unless they are rich prisoners, in which case they can be separately funded to avoid their suicide. Suicides in British prisons are way up. Physical injuries to prisoners are way up, but legal aid has been taken away from them. So there are these powerful enemies that have conspired to produce a discourse in this country which is very hostile to the Human Rights Act. And we'll see how it plays out in the election. The spectre over all of this is the European Union. We've not mentioned. The European Union is straightforward. It runs the place. If an Act of Parliament is in opposition to the European stuff, you have to disapply the Act of Parliament. The case of Factor Tame from 1989 makes that crystal clear. And until the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, the United Kingdom is a local government satellite of a European Union in legal terms. Bit longer. Sorry, Tony. There you are. That's it.
Very good. Thank you very much, Conor. Right. Now, time for a couple of questions. Right at the back there, yes? The microphone may or may not work, so speak loudly.
All right. I had a question when you were talking about the division of the Court of Chancery, Common Pleas and Bench. The court, Magistrates Court and the Crown Court, where does that fit in?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
And also, when you spoke of the Human Rights Act and the right of privacy, does that also include things like religious freedom, belief, etc., such abstract concepts?
Yes.
And to what extent, if they do? Because for one, it may be a belief, but for another, it may be ridiculous.
Yeah.
But how to defend it, and who establishes that criterion or ground?
Topical question.
Yeah, very good. Very good. I mean, but I would be brisk because I went on for so long earlier on. What was the first one we get? The magistrates' courts, where they fit. Basically, Crown courts. Statutory-based place for trying serious criminal offences. a successor to the quarter sessions, which were rooted in ancient history. So there are crown courts in all of these main cities, and the Old Bailey is a crown court. So serious cases and separate from the Royal Courts of Justice.
But they fall under the Royal Courts of
No,
Justice?
well, you can take an appeal to the Royal Courts of Justice.
Okay.
You
But
can
they
take
operate independently?
They operate independently, separate statutory scheme, etc.
And they are under the local justices?
No, the local justices then would deal with less serious matters and civil matters. The Crown Court would have serious criminal offences, and they would not really be the same as the justices of the peace. If you're caught riding your bike without lights, it'll be the justice of the peace. But if you murder your neighbour or murder the police officer because he stops you, that'll be Crown Court. So there'll be a consolation in that. It'll be a bigger sentence, but you'll be in a bigger place.
But I've heard that there's a jury in the Crown Courts, and the jury is somewhat a little more sympathetic and easier to handle.
Well, I can see you're already calculating your odds. This is. I think you should join that guy. You can advise him on the selection of the jury. And on the religion free speech one, what's fascinating is, of course, these issues now fall to be resolved by the courts. So you have clashes with rights, and say, take Article 9 of the Convention, which is the right to religious freedom and the right to propagate your religion, as against the right to freedom of expression in Article 10, and which wins, and which do you give priority to, and how do you analyse it. The most well-known one of this is Article 8, right to respect for privacy, versus Article 10, free speech. In the end, the judges decide. They decide how to manage it, which is why it is true that the Human Rights Act has given judges greater scope, but they cannot strike down legislation.
Okay, we'll take one at the back, then come here. Yes, right at the back.
What, in your view, would be the major implications of replacing the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights?
A subject that we've debated at the LSE in the recent past. Bill of Rights Act versus a existing Human Rights Act.
Yeah, I think I was involved with Michael Wills when he was trying to draft one for Labour, and I was not hostile in the way a lot of my friends were hostile. They thought it was a Trojan horse to destroy the Human Rights Act. It might be. But it's really hard. It's a bit like this nonsense over British values. Which bits they're going to leave out and which bits they're going to add. Sometimes my friends like David Davis, David's a great fan of this, says the right to jury trial. Well, you're going to have a right to jury trial for everything? This is completely absurd, you know. So they don't even mean a right to jury. They mean a right to jury trial for serious offences, which we already have. So what exactly else are they going to add? I think on balance, it probably is a Trojan horse to destroy human rights, because it'll take foreigners out of the Human Rights Act. So it'll keep the Act for, as it were, real British people, and it won't be available to others. Read Martin Howe QC's concurring report in the Commission on the Bill of Rights for an hierarchical approach to rights. True Brits, Europeans, and Johnny Foreigner. And, you know, you can access whichever right. It's like monorail cards, you know. No torture is available to everybody, but privacy isn't available because you're the wrong kind of guy. And I think that's probably what they're at. But they're also mainly just grandstanding. The whole thing is just, because they've got the EU Charter of Rights they can do nothing about. So it's all just tosh, really. Noise, reflecting the country's decline into subservient status.
Though presumably you could argue that, I mean, if going back to the notion of sovereignty and the original, the king, and that kind of ancient sovereignty, this is where the problem comes, is do you believe that that is indivisible and therefore all decisions should be made by that system? Or are you, as you yourself put it, making Britain a local outpost of a bigger system? I mean, that is a binary choice.
It is, and that's why the referendum confronts it.
Yeah.
Nobody, so far as I know, has said that Britain has no legal right to leave the European Union.
Sure.
It's quite interesting that that hasn't happened. Some southern states in America in the 19th century thought the same. Calhoun, who is not in fact our director, took the view that succession was a perfectly civilized thing that various states could do if they felt like it. It turned out that they were wrong. The then equivalent of Angela Merkel decided to destroy them. As things stand, it's not evident that Britain is going to be militarily subjugated if it leaves Europe. the European Communities Act 1972 can be repealed. There is a crystal clear binary choice being offered the British people if the commitment to the referendum is carried forward into the next administration.
It's the sovereignty is extended to allowing other people to make decisions over us. In a sense.
We don't entirely know, Tony, because, for example, if Mr. Farage bizarrely were to win the election, he might decide what you need is a clean break. So he might go for the European Communities Repeal Act 2015, which takes effect in January the 1st, 2016. A High Court judge would almost certainly refer that to the European Court of Justice on the question of whether there is an implied term of orderly exit. If the European Court of Justice were to hold that there is such an implied term, then the English courts would set aside that Act of Parliament, as they did the Merchant Shipping Act 1988, and the European Commission would start levying its swingeing fines. We would then be in a revolutionary situation where the courts would probably recognise a new authority, the British would refuse to pay, and there would be rather unpleasant consequences for the markets.
Right, very, very briefly, quick question and answer, please.
Yes,
We need to be out.
you observed, I hope you can hear me, that the thing that has had the most important impact in your lifetime has been electronic media.
I don't lead that dull a life. I think I meant professional life.
Whatever. Without hazarding a guess at your age, you then proceeded to talk for about 20 minutes about the ECHR, and then the last 15 seconds of your talk, you mentioned the ECJ. I put it to you, therefore, and it relates to the last question, that far from being electronic media have been so important, as indeed they have been important, it has rather been the impact of our membership of those two very different bodies, the Council of Europe and the European Union. They have had a far greater, and in my view, a far more benevolent impact on British law in your lifetime, sir, than anything else.
Right. Can I just say, I mean, actually I'm a big fan of both. So
Good.
let's just say that I was asked to speak about the British courts, their history, origins and development. And whilst I might well agree with you, I was sticking to my brief. And in defence of my choice of the most important thing that's ever happened in my life, kids aside, relationships, family, neutral citation, I think I may have over-egged that one.
Okay, good note to end on. Thank you very much, Connor. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. I'll no doubt see you all on Thursday at 6 o'clock. You, sir, were a bit late. Drafting the UK Constitution, 6 o'clock here in this building. Push for your point of view.
And next week, we'll be hearing from Professor Jerry Stoker from the University of Southampton, another Star Act, on recent reforms to Parliament and British political institutions.